Thank you. Welcome. Dr. Dewi Fortuna Anwar is a research professor at the Research Center for Politics, National Research and Innovation Agency. She is chairman and board of directors at the Habibie Center, an academician at Social Science Commission, Indonesian Academy of Sciences, and co-founder of the Foreign Policy Committee of Indonesia. Welcome and Ramadan Mubarak, Dewi. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
I don't know how many people had the chance to read the very interesting article titled Invisible Indonesia on the Great Decisions magazine. It was very comprehensive and covered a wide range of history for Indonesia. So I'll be asking towards the end of Dewi's thoughts on this article. But first, I wanted to ask about a relevant quote from the Indonesian Coordinating Minister for Maritime Affairs and Investment, which opens the Great Decision article. He said, quote, "America doesn't understand what Indonesia is doing. It's frustrating. As one of the world's largest democracies, the world's largest Muslim majority nation, and as an economic driver of ASEAN, why do you believe that Indonesia remains nearly invisible to many in the United States?"
Well, Hannah, I thought you were going to give me about 10 minutes.
Oh, no, you're right. I'm so sorry. Yes, please.
Before going straight, straight answers, but to answer first, why invisible? There are many reasons. Of course, one of the reasons is that there's limited historical connections between Indonesia and the United States. Indonesia is not one of the countries that's been colonized by the United States, like the Philippines. Indonesia is not tied into a military alliance or any alignment with the United States. Indonesians in general do not emigrate in great numbers outside, and so there are not that many Indonesian Americans, and there are many others. But I think before I get distracted, because you do ask me, to make a 10-minute broad sweep about what I would like to talk about. And since hopefully most of you have already read Invisible Indonesia, as an introduction to Indonesia's foreign policy, I thought I'll just talk about key drivers, that help to inform Indonesia's foreign policy making. And these key drivers act as constants, so that they do frame Indonesia's foreign policy making, and also at the same time, these key drivers produce contradictory impulses, also and behavior, and that also help to influence Indonesia's foreign policy. And I think that, like in any other country in foreign policy, geography does matter. And for Indonesia, the geography, there are several aspects. Yes, location. Indonesia is located at the crossroads between Asia, continental Asia to the north, and Northeast Asia to the north, and Australia to the south, and then the Pacific Oceans and the Indian Oceans. There are only two countries in the world that have shores in both the Indian Oceans and the Pacific Oceans. One is Indonesia, the other one is Australia. So this is really Indonesia is really an Indo-Pacific country. And because Indonesia has been at the crossroads, it has always been the crossroads of civilizations. Different civilizations have passed through Indonesia and have left their imprints in Indonesia. They have shaped the Indonesian cultures and Indonesian civilizations. And it's also been at the crossroads of trades. That the traveling of traders and cultures, have gone hand in hand. The arrival of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam to Indonesia have come basically through trade. So, coming from the Indian Oceans, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam, and then later on Christianity, came from the Indian Oceans, but also Chinese influence, Japanese influence come, from the north. So what it has shaped is that Indonesians and Southeast Asia in general, because we are at the crossroads, we have always been very open to outside influences, and have always been very able to adopt and also adapt and synthesize the various influences. And I think that also makes it needs to understand, why we are very different, for example, from the more homogeneous Northeast Asian, the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Koreans, who are not used to all this multicultural existence. For us, diversity, multiculturalism is a fact of life. So there are so many different religions in Indonesia. Islam is a majority, but we have sizable Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, and traditional beliefs. So that's a very important fact to remember in terms of attitudes. It shapes this openness and ability to bring different, sometimes competing sides together to sympathize. Also, with geographies, the form and the size. Indonesia is an archipelago, continental in size. The distance between the western part of Indonesia to the eastern part is the same distance between New York to LA. You know, it is truly continental in size, but it is an archipelago until the UNCLOS, until the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Seas. The over 17,000 islands were separated by the seas. Then, you know, the sea regime then, that each island would only have about 3 nautical miles. So this geographical fragmentation for Indonesia. So for Indonesia, the desire to unify the country, you know, to ensure that there's a unity between the land and the seas, have always been critical to its existence. So there's this sense of vulnerability. You know, there's the difficulty to control the country, the territory. So Indonesia has been really very active at the far front of the country that tried to initiate and fight for the acceptance of the United Nations Convention on Law of the Seas that recognizes the status of Indonesia as an archipelagic state. That means that Indonesia also has sovereignty over the connecting waters. So instead of being separated by international waters between the islands, under UNCLOS, you know, Indonesia is now a unified territory, as well as plus the territorial seas and the EEZ. And this is very, very important. And the size, as I said, is very continental. And because of that, on the one hand, because of this geographical fragmentation, it's much more difficult to safeguard all of these sea lanes and waters, especially if you don't have a strong navy. You know, there's a strong sense of vulnerability. You know, the country is very porous to, if not necessarily to invasion, but to incursions. You know, it's very difficult to safeguard the borders. And that makes, you know, Indonesian tends to be feeling always quite insecure and vulnerable. But at the same time, because it's of location and size, there's also a sense of regional entitlement that, you know, we are big, we are located here and straddling this very strategic waterway. So there's also the sense that, you know, any regional order should have Indonesia playing a role in shaping it. Then history is also plays a very important part. You know, in the past, before the colonial era, the great empires, the Majapahit, the Sriwijaya empires, the Majapahit empires, both great trading nations that traded with far Arabia and, you know, and they go as far as Africa, and had always been at the hub, you know, of this trade and cultural exchanges. But then the Europeans came, the European traders became colonialists, unlike the earlier traders. And there's this long periods, you know, it started with the Portuguese, who controlled parts of the Spice Islands, and then the Spanish, and then the British and the Dutch, and the longest was, of course, the Dutch. Long period of colonization, and then a short but brutal period of Japanese occupation that shaped Indonesia's awareness also. You have this great historical past, and then this great humiliations of being subjected to foreign powers. And then there's a long period of revolutionary struggle for independence. So Indonesia fought for its independence. There are only 2 countries that really fought for its independence. There's the Vietnamese and the Indonesians. So, you know, there's a strong sense of nationalisms and a very high premium being put on independence here. So I think that also needs to be understood. That also shapes Indonesia's foreign policy choices, that Indonesia unilaterally declared its independence in 1945, but the Dutch returned and tried to reconquer the country. But during that time, 1948, Indonesia already declared that its foreign policy would be independent and active. This is a reaction to the Cold War at the time in 1948, you know, just the emergence of the Cold War. There's the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc, and countries were being more or less forced to choose to one side or the other. Within Indonesia itself, there were ideological divides. Some argue that we are still fighting to complete our decolonization, so Indonesia should join with the progressive forces led by Moscow and Beijing. Beijing at the time was not yet there, that's later. And then others argue that, no, we want to develop our economy, we want to be a democracy, we should ally with the West, with the US-led bloc. But then the decision at the time, which I mentioned in my article, which you might have distributed, that the Vice President, Muhammad Hatta, was regarded as the father of Indonesian foreign policy. And they said, no, we have fought for our independence. We do not want to be tied to one or the other. We will chart our own course. So, Indonesia decided to have this free and active foreign policy doctrine, which became, part of Indonesia's national identity in a way. And Indonesia, as you know, organized the first Asian and Africans Conference in 1955, bringing all the new emerging countries in Asia and Africa together. That became a precursor for the non-aligned movement in 1961, which Indonesia helped co-founded. The essay on Invisible Indonesia sort of conflated, this event, the announcement of free and active foreign policy, the Bandung Conference, and the non-aligned movement. They were tied to each other, but they were different period actually. So this is also important. In terms, there's another driver is population. Indonesia has a big population, but extremely diverse. So being Indonesia is not natural. Before the Dutch, before the Netherlands, East Indies, there were so many different kingdoms who were at odds with each other, which made it easier for a small Dutch country to control this big territory because the people were not united. So the coming to Indonesia, the sense of nationalist awareness only came about in the early 20th century as a desire of the disparate people to fight for their independence. They say, if we remain disunited, we'll remain colonized. We'll never earn our independence. So nationalism becomes a major force, but it is an imagined community. And there's always this sense of, that national identity and national unity is never taken for granted. It's contested, and it remains contested. We still have problems in Papua, for example, until the early 2000s. We had the separatist movement also in Aceh. So Indonesians are always very highly sensitive of attempts to divide the country. And then material resources also very important. Indonesia is very proud of the fact that it is very rich in natural resources. All these countries, traders, and then colonial powers came to the archipelago, firstly because of the spices, which were more valuable than gold then, But then, Indonesia also is very rich in mineral resources, oil and gas and coal and copper, nickel, iron, various rare minerals, as well as plantations and so on. So very rich in natural resources. But at the same time, Indonesia is still in a very developing stage. So we're big population, but low level of skill. The majority of Indonesian populations only have primary school or even junior high school, and not very well skilled, not very well trained. So limited skilled workers here. And that means, limited capacity for embracing technology. And also, despite the rich natural resources, we also have limited capital to develop our resources. So when Indonesia exports, it tends to be exporting raw materials, still very, very primary commodities. And this has always been an issue for Indonesia, and this also creates a dilemma of dependence. On the one hand, there's this desire to be independent, to control the resources. On the other hand, also very dependent on outside countries for foreign direct investment, for technology transfer, and so on and so forth. So this also creates a lot of debates within Indonesia, to what extent we should be dependent, for example, on foreign direct investment. There's always an ambivalence. We need foreign direct investment, but people are always afraid that they would lose control. Then the other two drivers will be, of course, government. like in any other country, they do shape policy. In Indonesia, there's not been a sharp or radical swing in foreign policy since 1965, 66. Before during 1965, before 1965, President Sukarno, who was very nationalistic, very anti-colonial, anti-imperialism, prioritized decolonization, not just for Indonesia, but for all countries in the Asia and Africa. So he confronted what he called the old established forces, the West in particular. He confronted the US and the United Kingdom and so on, and very left-leaning. So Indonesia developed very close relations with Beijing. Indonesia's Communist Party at the time was actually the second largest after China. Indonesia itself is not, Sukarno was not communist, but he was tended to be very left-leaning. And then he fell, and Suharto came to power. He's from an army general, and he was very anti-communist, so froze diplomatic relations with China and focused on economic development, and that oriented Indonesia's foreign policy towards the major developed economies, which was mostly Western economies at the time. But since then, since I would say since 1966 to now, even after the fall of Suharto, there have been more continuity than change. The focus on economic development has continued. All Indonesian governments, since the New Order government, and then the post-Suharto period, the Reformasi period is now. There have been several presidents already. The focus on economic development remains. Also, of course, ensuring sovereignty, territorial integrity, and so on. So there's been more continuity. There have been changes in some priorities during President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono between 2004 and 2014. He was, of course, at that time, there's a lot of terrorism, and Indonesia being the second front after the Middle East. He was very concerned about strengthening Indonesia's democratic credentials and also Indonesia's moderate Muslim credential as well. So he was very active in promoting, this Indonesia's international image as a country where democracy, Islam, and modernity go hand in hand, and he was very active promoting democracy at a regional forum as well. While President Joko Widodo is very much focused on economic development, very narrowly for infrastructure development. So he is not interested in playing the global forum. He is more focused on bilateral diplomacy, for particularly economic diplomacy. So the government policies do change in terms of the emphasis. And of course, finally, you also need to pay attention to the leaders. SBY, President Yudhoyono, is very much a globalist and internationalist. He was very comfortable. He speaks good English, so he's very comfortable playing in the global stage and that leadership role. While Joko Widodo was a small businessman originally, and he's not very comfortable. So he's never attended the UN General Assembly, ever, except once by Zoom. And so he's very focused on just, a number of economic-oriented issues. He played a good leadership role during the Indonesia's presidency of G20, but then again, it's very much focused on the economy. So here, these are some of the key drivers that do sometimes lead to contradictory impulses. Trying to attract foreign investment on the other hand, being uncomfortable with it, trying to control it, and feeling very insecure and suspicious of external powers, but at the same time, feeling this sense of grandeur of, being big as a big regional player and so on, and not willing to allow other external powers to have too much of a say in the ASEAN regional order. And Southeast Asia is the primary theater for Indonesia's foreign policy, particularly exercising regional leadership, where Indonesia is seen as a natural leader in ASEAN. And Indonesia is very much focused and trying to achieve, strategic autonomy for the region. So, freeing it from external interference, but at the same time engaging with external powers with ASEAN as the base for managing the relations using ASEAN centrality. So I think that should be, my introduction. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'm just want to say really quickly that my internet has been a little bit finicky. So if I drop out, I might have to ask Ray or Betty to take over the questions that I emailed them last night, just so you know, but I'm hoping that it'll stay stable. I would love to dive into some questions about the presidential race that's been going on. My understanding is that it's likely that the former defense minister, Prabowo Subianto, will be the new president as of October. And he, interestingly, the campaign used TikTok to show himself as a cute grandpa, which I think was an interesting way to show a defense minister. So I'm curious if how his approach to both domestic and foreign politics will impact Indonesia. If you could speak on that a little bit. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I didn't completely answer the first question about why so little is known about Indonesia. As I said, because there's lack of historical link, that we are not an ally, and there are not many Indonesians there, and also Indonesia is pretty bad at promoting itself. We are really lagging behind our neighbors. Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia are much better at it. I mean, there are not that many Indonesian restaurants, for example, in the US. There are over 4,000 Thai restaurants. There are maybe equal numbers of Vietnamese restaurants, but not many Indonesians. And they're not very good connectivity. I'm not sure whether there's a direct flight between Indonesia and any US capitals. For a while, it stopped. Maybe that's back again, but it's still quite limited. So, we need, it is Indonesia's own fault, but mostly also because of policy. Because not much is known about Indonesia, the news that make it into the headlines is the bad news. So if there's tsunami, sure, Americans would hear about it. Or there's a major terrorist attack in Bali or Jakarta, then people will hear about it. But fortunately, no bad news has happened in Indonesia. No major bad news. We haven't had major natural disasters or major man-made disasters. So that we escape the CNN repetitions of bad news. That also make it that we are less visible. But also President Joko Widodo has not really played a very active role. He only visited the United States twice, I think. During his presidency, he's visited China so many times. So that shows you that the problems of invisibility in the US. I think we have lost Hannah.
Ray, are you there? Okay, yes, I'm wondering too if we also lost Ray. Okay, well, just hold up one second. I'm going to pull up. What I did is I filed your.
I do have a question, if that's an issue.
Donald, why don't you ask a question while I'm looking for the questions from yesterday?
Yes.
Hannah asked me. Sorry, Hannah asked me a question which I haven't answered, but she seems to have frozen.
Donald.
Yes,
Donald used to be on our board, so he's saving the day. This is really wonderful.
Well, Hannah's question essentially was the general that is set to take over after the current president. How would he respond to international politics? How the economists have actually challenged his credentials as to whether he would strengthen the democracy in Indonesia, or will he become a bit more authoritarian, for the lack of a better word? And I think that may have been what Hannah was trying to get at.
Yeah. Well, since Indonesia's president, like the US president, is an executive president, and it's very powerful. So clearly, any president will have a major impact on both domestic politics and foreign policy. And now, Prabowo, as you know, his credentials, he was not just associated closely with the new order government. He was the son-in-law of President Suharto. He was not known for being a reformer, and he had some problems. The fact that he was dismissed from his command in 1998 because he was accused of kidnapping a number of activists, some of whom remain missing. So clearly, there are concerns about the trajectory of Indonesia's democracy under Prabowo's presidency. But what is happening in Indonesia at the moment is not, it is still a question mark whether he would try to prove all the skeptics wrong. But what has had happened actually is that President Joko Widodo, who is a true civilian, who had no connections with the New Order government, who was elected on a very popular mandate and had a huge support from civil societies because he was seen as saving Indonesia from the threat of a Prabowo presidency also in 2014, 2019 elections. In fact, under Jokowi's watch, Indonesia's democratic credentials has gone down. So Jokowi has focused so much on the economy. Because of the nature of the fragmentation in Indonesian politics in 2019 elections, where identity politics really came to the fore. Prabowo really mobilized, that identity politics. Jokowi reached out to Prabowo, and in fact, reached out beyond Prabowo, brought so many parties to the cabinet that in the end, the government now has over 80% of the seats in parliament. This has been very much an opposition-less government. So throughout the Jokowi period, he's been able to push through unpopular legislations without much public discussions because, he's got the support of parliament. And so there have been a lot of criticisms that Jokowi has really undermined Indonesia's reform and weakened a lot of the reformasi institutions like the Anti-Corruption Commission and the Constitutional Court. And then, Jokowi's own interventions, that he abandoned his own party, the PDIP, the Democratic Party of Reform, under former President Megawati, and he gave his full backing to Prabowo, and then brought out his son as vice president. For us, we are in Indonesia at the moment, we are less concerned about what the possibility of Prabowo presidency would be, because for me, the civil society would be fully alert and awake under a Prabowo presidency. If that happened 2014 and 2019, now going to happen 2020, 24. But we have been more or less quiescent and asleep throughout most of the Jokowi presidency, and we find ourselves in this very unfortunate juncture where this past elections, I can tell you, is regarded to be the worst elections that we had during the Reformasi. Over 70 universities have spoken up against the way that the President Joko Widodo has really intervened and built political dynasty and tried to extend his power. So coming to, with Prabowo presidency, maybe we'll try to curtail even further Indonesia's democracy, but he will find a much stronger resistance because that society is much more awake, much more wary of him. And at the moment, we are just so very upset and unhappy that the president whom we trusted, in fact, has actually seen to be been betraying the spirits of the Reformasi. Now, when it comes to international relations, Prabowo is much more internationally minded than Joko Widodo. He's lived a lot of his life, for a long period of his life overseas. He's educated. He got his military. He went to the U.S. military academy as well. He spent a lot of his childhood in Europe, and he's been a minister of defense. So he's been a general. So he is very interested in foreign policy in general and on defense and security in particular. I don't think he is going to be uninterested. He will be willing to speak up in various forums Whether it will be well accepted or not, that's another matter, because he is quite a maverick sometimes. At last year's Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore, out of the blue, he started to offer a roadmap for Russia and Ukraine peace, which did not go too well down, including to the Ukrainians. So you can probably, Indonesia will not be too invisible when our president could speak up in international fora, which could be unexpected.
Well, thank you. And my apologies for my internet cutting out. And thank you for all who helped sub. So specifically, you've spoken a little bit about the foreign policy goals of the presidential candidate. And you mentioned in your foreign affairs article that, quote, the candidates revealed only very small differences when it comes to foreign policy. So more specifically, while still respecting the ideals of non-alignment, how do you think that the results from the elections might potentially alter Indonesia's relationships specifically with China and the US?
Yeah, it's interesting, Prabowo, because, it can only happen in Indonesia. Jokowi's main rival was Prabowo, and Prabowo had nothing good to say about Jokowi, before, between 2014, 2019, but then he joined the cabinet and has become a very loyal supporter of Jokowi. And he's run on a campaign of continuity. So he's promised to continue Jokowi's policy. And that means, Jokowi's signature policies is infrastructure development and participation in China's Belt and Road initiatives, participation in the China's-led Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank, and, very close relations, in fact, with China. So while Jokowi's only visited the United States twice, he visits several times. He visits China several times a year because, there are so many meetings related to the BRI and so on. Now, Prabowo, by saying that he will continue, basically, Jokowi is very concerned about his big, ambitious infrastructure projects, particularly like the development of the new capital and so on. And various other major infrastructure projects. Now, the question remains was that when he was campaigning against Jokowi, when he was running for president against Jokowi in 2014, 2019, Prabowo was extremely critical of Jokowi for being too close to China. Now, I've known Prabowo quite a while, and don't forget, he comes from an Indonesian army background, who is the DNA of the Indonesian army is very anti-communist, in which China was the primary threat. So for a long time, the army, the Indonesian, under the new order government, still looked to China with great suspicions. It's only after the fall of the new order government that relations improve with China, and it's become extremely close now under Joko Widodo. Now, the question mark will be, would Prabowo be as comfortable being as close and cozy with China, given his former instinct? And again, if you look at Indonesia's policy, it's very close to China economically, but on security issues, it's closer to the West. It's developed very close cooperation with the US. The bilateral military exercises between Indonesia and the US have grown bigger and bigger. The Garuda Shield has become Super Garuda Shield. I think Hannah has frozen again.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Ray,
I'm here on my phone. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, wonderful.
It's a wonderful tech day.
I don't know what is wrong.
Here we have Dewi in Indonesia having no problems whatsoever. We should ask what your system is. Our systems here in the US give us nothing but fits.
Well, I've been fortunate because sometimes I do freeze too.
Well, it is. It comes with the technology, but we love it still. Thank you, Hannah.
Sorry about that. So my next question is specifically as the world's largest Muslim majority country, how do you believe that the United States' relationship with Israel, especially given the current war in Gaza with the horrible death toll, will shape Indonesia's foreign policy moving forward, as well as the perception of the US among Indonesian citizens more generally?
Yeah, that's the main difference. Indonesia and the US are often on the same page when it comes to the Indo-Pacific issues. But when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, there's a fundamental difference, because Indonesia has been a strong supporter of an independent Palestinian state from the very beginning. In 1955 Bandung Conference, the issue of Palestinian independence was already mentioned, and now, so many years afterwards, all the other countries have obtained independence, but the Palestinian state has not really materialized. So Indonesia has not developed any diplomatic relations with Israel because Indonesia supports a two-state solution, and it says that until the independent Palestinian state has been achieved, we will not recognize the state. We will not have diplomatic relations with Israel. So this is the one major difference between Jakarta and Washington. So yes, what has happened in Gaza, particularly with so many deaths of women and children, and the fact that getting aids to Gaza is so difficult, and there is a strong feeling. The United States and many Western countries are cutting off assistance, to UNRWA and so on. So there is this feeling that a stronger sentiment that there is that real double standards when it comes to human rights, and the United States is losing a lot of sympathy and a lot of credibility because of this, not just in Indonesia but in many other Muslim majority countries. But it has to be stressed that Indonesia's support for Palestine at the people level is driven by co-religious sentiment, fellow Muslims. But at the government level, it's about decolonization. So it's less to do with religion and more to do with the fact that the Palestinian, like any other nation, deserves to have its independence. So we are all very concerned that the longer the problems goes at the public level, the less sympathy there is towards the United States.
Well, thank you very much for that response. I would like to pivot a little bit and talk more about the natural resources, which you mentioned towards the beginning. According to a Reuters article from March 5th, quote, Indonesia's mined nickel production has jumped from under 800,000 tons in 2020 to 2.03 million tons in 2023, which is quite a large jump, when it accounted for 55% of the global output. So I'm wondering how the surge in nickel mining has impacted Indonesia's economy and if it's at all influenced its foreign policy goals as well.
Yeah. For us in Indonesia, it's less to do about how much has been mined, but the fact that the smelters, that it's been processed in Indonesia. So the focus is very much about industrial downstreaming. So as I mentioned earlier, that Indonesia's natural resources in the past have tended to be exported in the shape of raw materials, with value added being enjoyed by other countries, not by Indonesia. And this is very much, so that's really very much like a colonial economy, where the developed countries just carry out the natural resources, leaving very little behind, and little value added, and quite often, just a lot of holes on the ground. So now there is a strong push, and this is a very popular move. There's always been this desire, to increase Indonesia's value added within the country. This is to elevate Indonesia's economy from simply this, raw materials, primary commodities exporting countries, to countries that can move up the ladder in terms of technology and knowledge-based economy. and have the ability to process. And Indonesia is not keen simply on exporting nickels, but it wants to become a major player in the production of batteries for electric vehicles. So this is considered to be part of the green energy, the green policy, part of the Indonesia's move towards decarbonizations. So it looks at this as, Indonesia wants to be a serious player in the battery productions for EV.
Interesting, thank you. Well, that kind of leads naturally to my next question. Speaking about green movements and decarbonization, I have seen now while preparing for this program that Indonesia has the greatest marine biodiversity and the second greatest terrestrial biodiversity in the world. And of course, this is partially due to the fact that it is a massive archipelago and there's so much water both within and near the border of Indonesia. So with the increasing impacts of climate change on our planet, how has that impacted Indonesia and its climate policy, both domestically and perhaps abroad?
Yeah, well, like all countries, Indonesia has not escaped from the impact of climate change. We have suffered extreme drought and also extreme rain and flooding. Drought have often caused major forest fires because we are the second largest tropical forest, and a lot of tropical fires means that there's also a lot of loss of biodiversities. There are many species which are endangered, and our marine diversity is also in danger because this climate change has also caused bleaching. So a large parts of our coral reefs have died because of bleaching, and that's also caused, of course, reduce the places where fish can breed. And it's also causing hardship to fishermen because there's fewer fish that they can catch. So this is a really serious issue for Indonesians. It has tried to mitigate this. Indonesia hosted COP13 in Bali 2017 and has tried to reduce greenhouse emission. It has committed to a target of on its own. Indonesia has committed to a target of about 29% of the reduction by its own effort. But if there is international assistance, conditional international assistance, it can go up to a reduction to 40% by 2030. This is quite ambitious. And in 2022, Indonesia has submitted an enhanced national determined contribution to 31.9% by its own effort, and to 43.2%, if there's international assistance. When Indonesia was the presidency of the G20 in 2022, the just energy transition was one of the key priority that Indonesia pushed forward. So it also tried to prevent deforestation. Cutting down forests for new plantation, for example, is not allowed. Burning forests is not allowed anymore. But there's also difficulty because on the one hand, there is this desire to ensure decarbonization because we need it, but at the same time, there's this policy towards rapid economic development, and they tend to contradict each other. Now, I mentioned about the smelters, which Indonesia is trying to promote as its effort towards decarbonization, because the production of batteries for electric vehicles, will be part of the clean vehicles, clean transportation for the future. But the firing, the power for the smelters, is coal-based because there's not enough green energy, so hydropower, solar power to power huge smelters. So the government, in fact, the Chinese investors are building more new coal-powered fire plants. So within the same Ministry of Mining and Energy, you see one Director General pushing for hydropower and clean energy and so on. But another one, pushing for, new for the smelters where you build new power plants. This is just sometimes it's quite difficult to make sure that all things align with each other. But this is just the reality that as the economy develops, there's just no easy answer for it.
Well, thank you very much for that answer. I will ask the next question in just a moment, but I want to remind everybody to please send in your questions to the Q&A. We'll begin that in about 5 to 10 minutes. So please send your questions to Ray. You can ask them yourself, or of course, you can also ask him to read them aloud if you're not comfortable verbalizing them. And I would now like to ask more about the Indonesia's global trade route, which is, of course, linked to its location on the water. How are China's actions in the South China Sea being regarded by Indonesia?
Yeah, well, Indonesia is not a party, it's not a claimant in the disputes in the South China Sea. I mean, China's so-called 9-dash line impinges on Indonesia's exclusive economic zone. But Indonesia doesn't have a claim that in the Spratly, so we're not directly affected by that. But clearly, we are all very concerned about China's increasing assertive behavior to claim the whole of South China Sea in its entirety, based on its traditional claims, which is actually not based on UNCLOS. While there are so many other claimants based on UNCLOS. There are 4 ASEAN countries which are claimants, namely, there's Brunei, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. And China has been particularly aggressive against the Philippines. So we are all very concerned about that, not just about China's policy, but also the increasing militarization of the whole of South China Sea, because the president of the Chinese Navy and arms coast guards have also led to other countries responding, like the United States and allied countries, carrying out more freedom of navigation operations. And now, we also see this development of AUKUS, this trilateral security pact between Australia, United Kingdom, and the US, in which the 2 nuclear-powered countries would transfer nuclear-powered submarines to Australia, which is a non-nuclear powered state. Indonesia's foreign ministry has come out openly criticizing AUKUS because fears that it might undermine NPT, because Australia is receiving this nuclear-powered submarine while it is party to NPT. That it may also push, it might actually accelerate arms race and create more instability. So we are all very concerned that as more countries having naval ships and patrolling the areas, there is always, not maybe intentionally, but there's always concerns about unintended clashes, at sea. So we are all very concerned about that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, not wonderful, but thank you for your response. All right. You've given a very comprehensive overview of both Indonesia and things that have impacted its history, its foreign policy. But I was wondering if, besides what we've spoken about regarding China and the US, are there any key issues facing US-Indonesian relations specifically that we have not yet discussed?
Well, Indonesia and the US have signed the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership. And if you look at it, it covers a wide range of issues. It covers politics, security, economic, social, cultural, technology, and so on. So there are a lot of issues. Trade is an issue, of course. Before China became Indonesia's largest trading partner, the United States used to be, the main traditional export market for Indonesia. And now, there are Indonesia enjoys some small trade surplus, and we're all very worried, if the US, the new administration, for example, is going to be much more punitive, for example, for countries that have where it suffered trade deficit. So that clearly, that would be a concern. Market access to the United States. The United States has tried to compete with China, put it that way, instead of just looking to China for infrastructure investment. The United States comes up with its own idea of IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. But people are looking at it yes, what's in it? How much trade access? In fact, market access is not there. So that is one of the issues. And then, there are these issues about technology. Now the US is trying to do this decoupling, de-risking, how would it affect Indonesia as, Indonesia develops close relations to China on certain areas? And would it affect Indonesia's exports to the United States? These are issues. I'm not an expert on this, but this is part of where economics impinges on, or where geopolitics impinges on economic issues. And then, there are still many ways that we can go about. On security, I think that the relations are generally healthy. As I mentioned earlier, when you started to freeze, and now, the bilateral military exercises between Indonesia called the Garuda Shield have now expanded to become Super Garuda Shield, that just involve so many other friendly countries. The last exercise last year was involving 14 countries, over 4,000, multiple forces, and multiple from many friendly countries. China is not included, but many other countries took part in that. And of course, we need more cultural exchanges. Experts on Indonesia used to study in the US. Cornell University used to be the go-to place for experts on Southeast Asia. Cornell, Wisconsin, and so on. Ohio, but now there are few and far between. So that there are not that many experts on Indonesia anymore. I taught for a semester at SAIS at Johns Hopkins University, teaching Indonesia. So they had a visiting professor, and then they don't really have consistency because they don't really have the fund to have area studies is gone. So there's not much actually places where people learn about Southeast Asia.
Well, I believe that Indiana University on the Bloomington campus does have an area studies major on Southeast Asian history.
Oh, good for you.
I believe you can even learn Indonesian there. So if anybody's interested, maybe contact IU Bloomington and learn about the resources. And perhaps we could develop some sort of a sister city relationship with Jakarta between Indianapolis. I'm not sure if that already exists, but if not, that would be wonderful because I'm a big proponent of citizen diplomacy. All right, so I will ask one more question before we turn it over to Ray for the Q&A. Specifically, I'm interested in learning about Indonesia's current role in the Association for Southeast Asian Nations and what role it will have moving forward. I believe you mentioned it's a leader of ASEAN, and I'm interested in learning more about that regional partnership since it's so important to the region. Thank you.
Okay, at the moment, Indonesia has been the leading proponent for the ASEAN strategy on Indo-Pacific. It's called the ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific. So this is actually a response to the emergence of initiatives by other countries, particularly response to when President Trump came out with his free and open Indo-Pacific at a forum in Hanoi at the time in 2017. There was this feeling that the US free and open Indo-Pacific is rather exclusive in nature, and it's rather aimed against China. It's part of the US-China rivalry. Then there's also Japanese free and open Indo-Pacific, which also tends to be rather exclusionary. So ASEAN, driven here by Indonesia, said, we cannot allow external powers only to decide what Indo-Pacific is about. So Indonesia in 2018, so even President Jokowi, who tends to be much more focused on economic issues, felt, we cannot allow ASEAN to be sidelined here because ASEAN centrality is considered to be very important. ASEAN is the primary regional convener where Indo-Pacific countries already meet, even without calling it Indo-Pacific. You know, the East Asia Summit, which ASEAN started since 2005, already have all the major Indo-Pacific countries. You know, there's all the ASEAN countries, but also China, Japan, South Korea, India, Australia, New Zealand, United States, and Russia, you know, as members. While the ASEAN Regional Forum include all of these countries, plus North Korea, plus all South Asian countries. So ASEAN already has the mechanisms, the platforms for bringing all of these people together. So Indonesia proposed that there should be an ASEAN strategy, but then they said, you know, strategy is too strong a word. So it's just an ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific, in which ASEAN stresses a number of principles. The first is ASEAN centrality, that there should not be a new regional mechanism, but make use of existing ASEAN mechanisms, because ASEAN is already convening all of these meetings. And secondly, that and among others, that it should be transparent, open, and inclusive, i.e., that it should not be aimed against anybody. And then it explicitly said that, you know, it wants to that ASEAN outlook on the Pacific looks at tries to promote a habit of dialogue and changing the mindset from zero sum to positive sum game. You know, so this is very much the way that ASEAN would like to go forward, and it tries to achieve this through more concrete activities, focusing in 4 areas. It's maritime, connectivity, SDGs, and economic and other issues. And last year, when Indonesia chaired the ASEAN, it held, for the first time, it held the ASEAN Indo-Pacific Forum, trying to bring, you know, various business and private sectors and governments together. Hopefully, this will be continued and will have a clearer, a greater strategic thrust. At the moment, I felt that the ASEAN Indo-Pacific Forum is too practical at the lower level. You know, I don't see how it could actually leverage and try to transform distrust into trust among the major powers. You know, so clearly, you know, we need to have a clearer link between the activities and the platform for bringing China and the US and India and Japan together in a practical cooperative project, for example. You know, so clearly this is still homework that needs to be done.
Well, thank you again for answering all of my questions, my wide-ranging questions. I have many more, especially based off of the Great Decisions article. I'm curious on your thoughts, but first I want to turn it over to Ray to begin the more public portion of the Q&A. If he is here. Ray?
Actually, I don't, yeah.
You might not be here. Okay. I will go ahead and ask one more question then while we're waiting. Maybe he's also having internet issues. But okay. Well, I'm curious if you have any other reflections on the Great Decisions article, if you have any thoughts on
Hannah, I'm sorry, I don't want to I was just thinking that since Ray is not here, maybe you could play that role, that is to say, open it up to the public to ask that question, so other people could ask the questions, you know. So.
Actually, yeah. I'm back here. I'm sorry. Can you hear me? I'm sorry. Yes. Okay. We did have, actually, thanks, Donald. If I do go out again, Hannah, take over for me. So we had several questions in the queue. I think Lois Meyer was actually first in line there. So Lois, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Okay. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Thank you so much. This is very interesting. I don't believe I've heard you make any reference to the Philippines. And I would love to know what Indonesia's relationship with and attitude toward the various Marcos dictatorships in the Philippines. And if you will permit me to give a little background to this, about 9 months ago, I was stunned to receive an email request for a thesis I wrote as a college student decades ago on the anti-clericalism of the Philippine hero, Jose Rizal. And it's from a young Filipino scholar studying in England, because his topic is so dangerous in the Philippines. He's trying to figure out why the Filipino public keeps electing dictatorship-oriented governments. And so I'm very curious, given what you've said about Indonesia's governmental sways, what Indonesia says about, thinks about, acts about the Filipino various dictatorships.
Well, Louise, I mean, among us political scientists in Indonesia, we are very worried about the Philippinization of Indonesian politics.
Oh,
We are
wow.
moving towards dynastic politics.
Okay.
I mean, Joko Widodo just, put his son vice president.
Okay. Yes.
And supported Prabowo, delivering us, someone who is supposed to be, the epitome of the New Order regime in power. Prabowo would never have made it without Jokowi supporting that, So there is a sense that, we thought that we are much more advanced, in terms of our politics. It's much more meritocracy, greater plurality. While in the Philippines, of course, the economy is controlled by few large families who also control politics, because politics, money, they are very interchangeable. In the Philippines, it's not the military who's powerful, it's the civilians. Marcos is a civilian, but made use of the military. While in Indonesia, during the New Order government, it was the military who was very powerful. And after the Reformasi, the fall of Suharto, we tried to control the military, and the military has behaved very well. But under Joko Widodo, there's an attempt again to mobilize. They use the military to mobilize support for candidate number 2. So our democracy is in a pretty bad shape at the moment. But on the other hand, I'm an optimist that this will trigger again anxiety, and that we will be much more alert. In Indonesia, the difference is that there are conglomerations and so on, but we do not have the kind of clan, the powerful clans, landed clans who really control the economy to such and etc. Although Indonesian politics is very much controlled by oligarchy now.
Yeah.
Power, money, media, they're all coming
Well,
together.
and what this young man is looking at now is the church and the church's control of politics, which of course we're facing in the United States.
Yeah, which is very different. The Catholic Church is very hierarchical, and it's always been very political. The Catholic Church tends to be very involved in politics, for better or worse. It's been progressive. It's also supported progressive politics, in Latin America, but maybe less so in the Philippines. But I'm not an expert on the Philippines. I only did Philippines as in my BA. In my BA, I did an essay on Jose Rizal. So I know my earlier history about Bonifacio and Jose Rizal, and and the early period also, but the Marcos era. Well, during the before the fall of Suharto, during the Marcos period, of course, when I did my research on ASEAN, I remember visiting various ASEAN countries. There's a very strong support for ASEAN cooperation, because it really ensured peace and stability between the countries, particularly after Indonesia's confrontations against Malaysia and Singapore. But when I went around talking to civil society, and they said, they were very critical of ASEAN, because they said, ASEAN is an organization where authoritarian leaders learn from each other, and they protected each other, and that the ASEAN's principles of non-interference, which is good. I mean, it is not an ASEAN principle; it's the United Nations Charter. Where you are not supposed to intervene in the politics of other countries. But within ASEAN, for a while, it became a sacred cow. By you can say, we can't interfere, even though there's lots of gross violations of human rights in neighboring countries. You turn a blind eye, you don't criticize. because of the principle of non-interference. Now, after Indonesia's reform, it changed this a bit, and in fact, Indonesia is the one that pushed for the inclusions of the language about democracy, human rights, rule of law, good governance into the ASEAN Charter. But, this always coexists very uncomfortably. Which one would trump first? Whether, most of the ASEAN countries tend to be much more conservative, especially the newer ASEAN members. They enjoy going to ASEAN so that they'll be protected, that they will not be interfered with. And that ASEAN will protect them from external criticisms. Although now ASEAN is no longer doing that to Myanmar, ASEAN said, we will not protect you anymore. But amongst some of the ASEAN countries, they are wedded to the idea of absolute non-interference. But in Indonesia, depending on the government, during the earlier government of President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, a general, by the way, but very reformist and very keen to promote Indonesia's democratic credentials. Indonesia is very active promoting democracy in the region. But under Joko Widodo, they're not terribly interested because the focus is very much on economic issues. But still, when the military junta launched that coup d'etat, the Indonesian government led ASEAN to sanction Myanmar, that the Myanmar leadership has been disinvited to ASEAN meetings. But Prabowo used the same public, this IT guy, apparently from Eastern Europe, that Bongbong Marcos used. So that cute gimmick, apparently, just use the gimmick and don't use substance, don't talk about policies, don't talk about issues, just sell an image so that you can win all these millennials who don't care about issues. They say,
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Lois. Claire, I think you had a question.
Yes. Why is Indonesia moving its capital from Jakarta? And does this have anything to do with climate change? Like, is Jakarta going to be underwater? I noticed on the map that there's a new one, and I think it said 2024 it was moving.
Well, that's an ambition. That's very much President Joko Widodo's great ambition. There's always been, in fact, from the beginning of Indonesia's independence, President Sukarno had wanted to move Indonesia's capital to Kalimantan, which is the Kalimantan, Borneo, is in the middle of Indonesia. Indonesia's economic development has always favored the West. So most of the capital, most of the intellectuals, most of the cultural activities are in the western part of Indonesia. So there is the eastern part of Indonesia tends to lag behind. And so the idea is that moving the capital to the center would help to accelerate economic development, not away from Java, from western part of Indonesia. So that's the logic. Joko Widodo campaigned on he promised that he would like to develop Indonesia from the periphery, from the remote areas. So the areas chosen is considered to be, right in the middle. So there is that one economic dimension, but there is this ecological dimension. Jakarta is too crowded already. It is sinking slowly because now the land, particularly in northern part of Jakarta, is lower than the sea. So every time there's high tide, part of Jakarta is already flooded. So in terms of capacity to bear more people, Jakarta is not in a good shape. It's always congestions, problem with waste disposal, pollution, and so on. But whether it is the right policy to try to move Jakarta, the capital, within 3 years, that's another matter. That's very much still a debated issue. But now that Prabowo has won, he has campaigned on the promise of continuing Jokowi's policy. So that will, that capital will probably move.
Is the population on the east growing more? I just wondered if it was because it's a political move, Would this garner him more votes? Since you brought it up,
No,
that
no,
he's moving that.
not really, because most of the votes are in Java. In the eastern part of Indonesia, there are less people. So in Kalimantan, there are not that many people.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Ann Kolb has a question.
Hi, thank you. So I have a small backstory before my question. So I'm from Fort Wayne, Indiana, and we have a children's zoo here. When I was in grade school, they opened an exhibit that was the Indonesian rainforest. The last 30 years, that has been a main exhibit of our zoo and was a huge part of my life growing up. Then fast forward to when I was in college and drinking coffee, Indonesia was high on my list for Sumatran coffee. And then throughout my time there, as I was preparing to get married and go on a honeymoon, Bali was high on my list. So this is all just a backstory to say that Indonesia has really been, at least in my life, been a really prominent place that has had lure and intrigue, and always wanted to be a place that I wanted to visit. And but I was curious, because none of those things came up in the discussion today, if there are any specific I guess protections for those pieces of culture, or if those are still being used to help connect others to Indonesia, especially as as you're saying that we in the United States don't have very many ties. Are those used intentionally, or do you find that they're becoming more protected now?
Well, when it comes to rainforest, this is we are struggling, because deforestations in the past occurred because for economic development, plantations and so on. Now the government has issued regulations to prevent more deforestations. But still, because of climate change, also coming back, for example, to Kalimantan, where you have the orang-utan there and so on, that's and these are becoming very endangered now, because Kalimantan also peat, and it easily catches fire even without deliberate firing, sometimes, because if it gets too hot, it just gets burned, and it's very difficult to put down. So our rainforests, and our biodiversity need to be protected all the time. And of course, there's always illegal loggings as well. Coffee, yes, Indonesia is a major exporter of coffee. I'm a coffee drinker. If you go to Karibo coffee, I think, I know that in Washington or New York, they have so many different there's expensive coffees that we don't in Indonesia don't drink, but you sell them in this specialty shop. So I can't afford to buy kopi luwak. It's the most expensive coffee in the world. But we are very proud of our coffee. And Bali still, it's recovering. I was in Bali last week. Apparently, the governor of Bali has just introduced tax for foreign visitors, 150,000 rupiah, which is about 10, 11 US dollars. And apparently this is to help clean up Bali because the beach was getting quite dirty, plastic waste and so on. So they're trying to control the number of tourists, because they're concerned about that too many tourists sometimes can also lead to unmanageable waste. But I do hope that you'll be able to go to Bali. It's a special place.
Me too. I hope to visit all of it. We actually had a baby orangutan born in November of last year, and it was really exciting. And unfortunately, they're not sure why, but very shortly after a healthy birth and a healthy baby, but a couple weeks later, it passed away. So we, our whole city mourned that.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, but it's a pretty special place. Our zoo has a pretty cool location, and the exhibit for Indonesia is really beautiful. So
All right.
Thank you for
Ann.
answering.
All right. Larry, you got a question or two?
Yes, thank you. For many of us of an age, the last time Indonesia was really high on our radar was the movie 40 years ago, the year of living dangerously, about the attempted coup in 1965 against the Sukarno government, which, speaking of tourism, probably didn't encourage a lot of people to want to visit Indonesia right after that. And ironically, I think that a lot of that was filmed in the Philippines rather than in Indonesia. But
Yeah.
my question really isn't about that. I was just curious if China has approached Indonesia on Belt and Road Initiative projects. I mean, obviously Indonesia has a desire to grow from an exporter of raw materials to one that can do value-added kind of exportation and such. You know, has China offered any help in that way? And have you? I know you want to go it alone in many ways, and China's help always comes with strings attached. But what's your experience been with China involvement in infrastructure projects?
Well, China is involved in several infrastructure projects. The one that smelters for nickel in Morowali in Sulawesi, that's Chinese. Chinese funded and Chinese operated. There are a lot of Chinese workers there as well, although they also have large numbers of local workers. But the fact that there are also some blue-collar workers from China have also created tension. Then Indonesia has just China has built the first high-speed train in Indonesia between Jakarta and Bandung. There was competition from two tenders from Japan and China won that bidding. So now Indonesia has the first high-speed rail in Southeast Asia from Jakarta to Bandung. It's quite fancy. I've traveled there, you know. So it only takes 45 minutes from Jakarta to Bandung, but it takes me 1.5 hours from my house to get to the station in central Jakarta. So maybe I'll just take my car to Bandung in that respect. Yeah. So there are many projects where China is involved, and that is one of the. So there are only two. Before China came in, Japan was the only one who really invested in infrastructure. We have an MRT in Jakarta that's built by Japan. There are a lot of ports, a lot of highways are built by Japan. So Japan was able to dictate terms in a way. So for us, it's good that China came in as a competitor, because and we like to have more. We unfortunately a lot of Western countries, we do not have the same business models Japan and China, where they can invest in large-scale infrastructure projects, because it tends to be more private-owned companies, and they don't want to pay to build bridges and train stations and ports, because it tends to be longer term and risky. But one of the promise from the United States is that it wants to be involved in quality infrastructure projects. So we are still waiting. Indonesia is very open.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Larry. I think we don't really have any more questions from the audience at this point, but I have a question.
I have a question, if that time will still be permitted.
Sure, go ahead, Donald.
Yes, I didn't put my name down, but I was thinking Suharto, he's such a fascinating figure for me. And I was just wondering how he's appreciated in Indonesia, especially within the thinking class within Indonesia. In spite of some of the excesses, he did check communism. He developed a closer relationship with Singapore. The former leader of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, spoke well of Suharto, and even his son succeeding him also spoke well of Suharto. And it's remarkable that you said that even with his fall, the policy space that he's created still endures. So I'm curious, how do people in Indonesia really assess the value of Suharto?
It depends who you talk to. Maybe among the common people, they miss Suharto, the stability, the continuity, the rapid economic development. But if you talk among the intelligentsia, there's still mostly criticisms about the strict political control, human rights violations, the really creating very little civic space. There's control over what you have to think, what you have to say. Papers have to exercise self-censorship. Academics have to exercise censorship. We have to ask permission from the police before you can hold a seminar. You have to be very careful what you write, So those kind of things probably don't matter to people in the rural area, but among the urban educated people, the feeling about Suharto is still very negative in that sense. But in terms of policy, it has endured. For example, Suharto has always ensured that during his time, he always put very competent technocrats in charge of the macroeconomic. And that has endured. So despite the political parties come and go, and they appoint politicians who do not necessarily have the necessary skills or educational backgrounds to hold a particular ministry. Like in any democracy, you can you appoint political leaders who are not necessarily experts in their areas, but the economic portfolio, particularly finance, has always been ring-fenced. It's been left to the professional. And again, with Indonesia democracy, people have very high expectations of democracy, not that it would give greater participation to the public to choose their own leaders, to have a say in how policies are made, but that government should also deliver, because Indonesians are so used to long period of economic development, high growth, job security, employment, health, education, good infrastructure. So there is an expectation that the government would deliver. So democracy is not only judged by whether it is free and fair in the elections, but whether the government is functional as well. So in this sense, regardless of, in fact, that is a lot of the criticisms against the governments in the reformasi area, that is sometimes this zigzag in policies, lack of continuity. People expect government to be much more consistent in delivering, public welfare. So Indonesia it's a strong believer in big government. They expect the government to provide jobs, to provide healthcare, to provide, to not just to provide security, but also to be active in the economy. So while the US, for example, is very critical of China, the role of the state-owned enterprises, in Indonesia, the state-owned enterprises are expected to play the major role in building this infrastructure development, so like electricity, water, the major sectors which are regarded critical to delivering public goods, are expected to be delivered by state-owned enterprises. And that has
Thank you.
remained.
Thank you. That's a good assessment. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Donald. Well, it's about that time. I think we need to let Dewi go to bed. It's midnight, coming on in midnight there in Indonesia. So we really do appreciate you taking the time to meet with us today. This has been a fascinating talk, especially on a topic about which many Americans don't know much. So we really appreciate you taking the time. Hannah, I want to thank you for setting this up. This was a terrific presentation we had tonight. Those of you in the audience, thank you for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you at our last two Great Decisions programs coming up in the next couple of weeks. Again, thank you very much and good night.
Good night. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.